Hi, apologies for the lack of light. I'm in South Africa and load shed. I'm picking up on page 88 of White Tears, Brown Scars by Ruby Hamad. The simultaneous protection and subordination of white women was central to the professed logic of lynching. Black women were raped without consequences by white men because their blackness placed them in the construction of outside the construction of womanhood. And this is where we pick up again. To understand race in the settler colonial context, we must understand the centrality of sex. It all came down to sex, who was allowed to have it, when, and with whom. It was through sex work that some white women were able to assert financial and social independence. It was through rape that slavery was enforced and reinforced. And it was through procreation that whiteness and white male authority could be both bolstered and undermined. Segregation, lynching, and black peril all occurred for the same reasons, to keep white men on top. White society then hinged on the myth of protecting white women from rape, but in reality, they were really protected from what was their own liberation and capacity to form meaningful relationships with people of color. Miscegenation was reviled not because it was unnatural and against God's will, as claimed, but because white people really thought that black people were dirty. It was feared because it threatened white male domination and white supremacy, which hinge on maintaining a fictional notion of racial purity as a mask for economic and political power. This fiction of the white race that we consider white is only a racial category where anything mixing automatically excludes one from the racial group. Indeed, for a long time, the one drop rule meant that just one drop of black blood, even going back several generations, could, and often did, leave the fairest looking white ostracized from white society. One of the earliest critiques of the model of the white womanhood comes from one of the most deliberately underrated figures of the suffragette era. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was a poet, journalist, fiction writer. Da, 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 da. Nobody's even listening. Let's pick up where I left off. Looking back over the history of race and gender, it is startling to see how it all came down to sex, or more specifically, to the regulation of sex in order to sustain structural power. White supremacy is economic and political domination through the policing of racial purity. For it to succeed and appear natural in the same time necessitated the manipulation of the image of virtuous white women to represent the white race as one of impeccable morals, far superior to the sex-crazed and animalistic inferior races, and therefore the peak of civilization. At the same time, the damsel's true purpose was to prevent the races from mixing and procreating freely, equally, and happily. The damsel in distress is always white because, in order to justify white men's self granted right of access to the body of any woman they choose, regardless of how she felt about it, only white women were considered capable of being in distress, of being raped. Think about this for a moment. Rather than consider respecting the bodies of brown and black women, white men and their female accomplices removed them from the concept of womanhood and humanity altogether. Chivalry, protecting white women, restricting their movements and suppressing their sexuality, imprisoning brown men, lynching and executing black men, raping colonized women, all of this bolstered white male and by extension female power, while conveniently absolving white people of any wrongdoing by permitting them to project their own sexual violence onto black and brown men, and then to punish them ruthlessly. When I think of this history, I think of Oscar Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray, the handsome but hedonistic anti-hero sells his soul to the devil and, rewarded with everlasting youth and beauty, embarks on a decade-long rampage, knowing his portrait is hidden in the attic that will bear his scars and sin of his cruel criminal behavior. As the years pass, Dorian stays young and beautiful, while his pictorial likeness becomes withered and grotesque, as every irredeemable act he commits, from callously breaking his lover's heart to murder, is recorded on its passive body. Eventually, faced with the true horror of his crimes and the knowledge that he has been damned to hell, Dorian attempts to destroy the painting, only to fatally stab his own heart. The crimes of white supremacy have not gone unrecorded. They are etched into the bodies of brown and black people the world over. Our scars, past and present, physical and emotional, bear witness to the violence that white men and women insisted that they were not inflicting. White society marked bodies of women of color as a receptacle for its sins, so it may claim innocence for itself, and the chosen symbol of the innocent perfection of whiteness, the white damsel with her tears of distress functions as both denial of and absolution for the violence. From Miss Cromer to Carolyn Briand to Barbecue Becky, the white damsel in distress has never shied from damning people of color to bolster her own status and help white society prosper at our expense. But absolution is not for the perpetrator to grant, and white people will eventually have to reckon with the true horror of their own brutal history. Frances Harper's challenge rings clear in its truth now as ever, when white women are ready to, whether white women are ready to face it or not. For women of color to be free of racism, and for white women to be rid of patriarchy, it is the damsel who must be damned. Chapter 4. When tears become weapons. White womanhood's silent war on women of color. Being victimized when we're young, when you're seen as strong, is really difficult because no one believes you. This is from Nadine Shamali, a community organizer. Mary Beard is no stranger to social media storms. The Cambridge professor, aka Britain's best-known classicist, has said that she regards a prolific online presence as a part of her responsibility as an academic. This means she has frequently drawn the ire of Twitter troll patrons. In 2017, the historian who counts ancient Rome among her specialties responded to an alt-right figure, Paul Joseph Watson, who mocked a BBC cartoon depicting a family in Roman Britain with skin tones ranging from pale to black by tweeting, "Thank God, the BBC is portraying Roman Britain as ethically diverse. I mean, who cares about historical accuracy, right?" Watson was undeservedly assured in his mockery. Ancient Europe was far more diverse in its history than our current concepts of identity assume. Beard let him know, but Quintus Lollius Arbucius, a governor of Britain who'd been born in what is now Algeria, this unleashed a barrage of abuse against Beard, whose qualifications were somehow deemed irrelevant. Twitter users who knew better dismissed her perspective as political correctness gone wrong and accused her of trying to rewrite history, treating her to a torrent of aggressive insults on everything from my historical competence and elitist ivory tower viewpoint to my age, shape, and gender. But on February 17, 2018, he had posted a tweet that ignited a different kind of storm, one of which she played a different role, though perhaps her past experience with trolls did not lead her to see it this way. In response to the unfolding scandal involving Oxfam aide and staff abusing sex workers in the aftermath of 2010's Haiti earthquake, Bia tweeted, "Of course, one cannot condone the alleged behavior of Oxfam staff in Haiti and elsewhere, but I do wonder how hard it must be to sustain civilized values in a disaster zone. And overall, I still respect those who go in and help out where most of us would not tread." It's a particularly disappointing tweet coming from a history professor. The backlash was immediate, this time from people of color. One of those critics was fellow Cambridge scholar Priyambanda Gopal, also a friend of mine, who took exception to Beard's apparent minimization of the brutality of colonialization. Gopal wrote a Medium post outlining to Beard why her tweet was being criticized, calling it an example of genteel patrian racist manner that is pervasive in academia, while noting that this is more progressive. This is the more progressive end of the spectrum. Twitter pylons can be so over the top that separating the wheat of legitimate critique from the chaff of abusive trolling can sometimes feel like an exercise in futility, so I have no doubt that much of the criticism leveled at Beard got unnecessarily nasty. Nonetheless, there are attacks, and this is constructive. There are attacks, and there's constructive criticism. And Beard seemed to make no differentiation between the two. Is anyone here? Please say something in the chat if you are. apologizing not for the content or the implications of her tweet, but for attempting to inject nuance into the discussion. She posted a teary selfie of herself pleading, "I'm really not the nasty colonialist you think I am. If you must know, I'm sitting here crying." This is when things took what is now a familiar turn. Russian academic Flavia Zordan marveled at Bia's white feminist tears and commented on the extensive sentimentality people would go through, debasing themselves if necessary in order to sustain their ignorance, bigotry, or both. Anthony. And Agnes Dongpanduka described Bia's tearful display as a typical white woman's move to innocence. Others quickly came to the defense of Beard, namely white feminist journalist Helen Lewis, who claimed Beard wasn't playing the victim but just being honest, and Hadley Freeman, who dismissed the criticism of Beard as the textbook definition of bullying, mocking someone for showing weakness. These defenders really didn't get it. In this context, Beard's tears were not a sign of weakness, they were a reminder of her relative power. It is significant that all of the times Beard has been dragged on Twitter, albeit by sexist, racist trolls, this is the first and only time when her critics were women of color that she responded by publicly crying. Most disappointing is that Beard clearly is intimately knowledgeable about how women's voices as a whole have been marginalized from power. In fact, she literally wrote a manifesto on it. Santi, if you have any questions, let me know. Woman in Power, published in 2017. And yet, when it came to criticism, even fellow academics and feminist writers who warned her she was contributing to the silencing of non-white women by diminishing their concerns, she was unable to see past her own innocence and victimhood. Her tears made Gopal and other women of color critiquing her seemed the nastier and more irrational. Gopal in particular became the target of vicious attacks. The entire incident demonstrates how easily white women can slip between their one-up and one-down identities. When I first wrote about it, I didn't know that this had been a subject of academic study for much longer than the topics of white women's tears and white feminism have been in the public eye. In 2007, researcher Mamta Motwani, then postdoctoral fellow at the University of Houston, wrote a paper called When White Women Cry, How White Women's Tears Oppress Women of Color, in which she argues that white women's experience of gender is not racially neutral. Rather, just as black and brown women are caricaturized by the negative images governing society's perception of their racial communities, so too are white women's experiences, shaped by internal expectations and external perceptions of what it means to be a white woman in a white-dominated society. White women's racial privilege is predicated on the acceptance of their role of virtue and goodness, that they can't do anything wrong, which is ultimately powerlessness. It is this powerlessness, or I would argue, the appearance of powerlessness, that governs the nature of white womanhood. As she notes, womanhood in general has been subordinated in patriarchal societies, but whiteness has positioned white womanhood above other women. This leaves women of color defined by two layers of oppression. To put it simply, women of color are both too racialized and too gendered to be taken seriously and treated with respect. The history of the white damsel in distress has entrenched the notion of white woman's innocence, and it is this that sees onlookers flocking to soothe white women's emotional distress. At the same time, the historical debasement of women of color positions them as the guilty party. I've been in this situation so many times. By posting a close-up of herself literally crying, or at least appearing to be, Beard pivoted from her one-down identity, woman, to her one-up identity, white, from her usual public role of feminist agitator to the powerless role of damsel in distress. Not only did she perpetuate the derogatory rhetoric about uncivilized non-Western countries, but the moment she began crying, the entire tone of the incident necessarily shifted. It was no longer about what she said or why it upset so many people of color. It was about her feelings, her innocence, her victimhood, her strategic white womanhood. Any questions so far? I need to get some water. It is presented as helplessness and sentimentality, but it is a power move. The power of the damsel is that she provokes a protective urge, sorry. Whoever is making her cry must be the one at fault, unless it's a white man. But more on that in the next chapter. At the same time, the reductive archetypes governing the representation of women of color also kick into play. Angry, scary, cold, aggressive. That doesn't mean that the tears are always genuine, even if they are strategic. I have no doubt many white women genuinely feel like they're being attacked simply by virtue of women of color disagreeing with them. White people are so rarely ever outside our racial comfort zones that we have been warned all our lives not to go outside of our racial comfort zone, and we feel we come to feel entitled to racial comfort. Robin DiAngelo explained to me when I interviewed her during her US book tour of the summer of 2018. So if you challenge any of that, we can't handle it. Our capacity to handle that is basically zero. And I will lash out and do whatever I need to do to get you to stop challenging me. And so if that's cry, I'll cry. I might not even be consciously thinking about it, but that's how it works. It's really good that a white woman is actually acknowledging this, but whether she changes her behavior is yet to be seen. In other words, those tears may well be genuine, but that doesn't make them innocent and harmless. Quite the opposite, in fact. As soon as I cry, all of those resources are going to go back to me, and you, the person of color, are going to be bad. And that's why I think it's a form of bullying. DiAngelo continues, I bet you put up with way more racism from white people every single day than you bother talking to us about. This is true. And why don't you bother? Because you're probably going to get punished worse. Yes. And so it's just a beautiful form of white racial control. You stay in your place, and I stay in mine. And then I get to claim you as my friend. You're my coworker. See, I'm not that racist, but only as long as you don't challenge my identity and my position. DiAngelo is right, of course. I do put up with a lot more racism than I bother to point out, and I am someone who writes about racism for a living. In fact, I would say there's barely a woman of color alive today who hasn't been on the wrong end of a white woman's tears multiple times in her life, with far worse consequences than those faced by Professor Gopal in her challenge to Mary Beard. Gopal's status as a high-profile academic, as well as her self-admittedly privileged upper caste background in India, means doesn't mean she isn't subject to the same consequences as women with less status, although racism does make her job more strenuous than it would be otherwise. And having spoken to Professor Gopal, she is how do I describe her? Her sense of humor is acidic, and it's beautiful. Her laugh is from her belly, and when she smiles, you can see it like the light sparkle in her eyes. And she's a wonderful, wonderful human. But the way she carefully chooses her words, she never minces them. She's a little bit goofy outside of her academic persona. And all she does is love her cat and talk about the fact that like her neighbor built a second story on their house and now she can't have sex in her garden. It's like she's that blunt. She's wonderful. But she chooses her words very, very carefully when it comes to the things that she argues. And that's for a reason, because she knows what the consequences are of being a brown woman in the public sphere. It has only been in the process of writing this book that I've begun to gain the understanding of how pervasive this experience is for a majority of women of color. How much it shapes, limits, and mars our lives, and most frustratingly, how little resources we have. She is really awesome. I adore her. And most frustratingly, how little recourse we have to seek accountability from those who do it to them. Perhaps few conflicts are more ubiquitous and contentious for women of color than the ones that arise due to the insistence of white women on playing with their hair. Xenia, a 30-something Palestinian Canadian, lived in Australia for about 5 years. She claims to have the same hairstyle, long, thick, curly brown hair to her waist, since her late teens, and a common occurrence for her is for white women to touch and play with it. And honestly, I have straight hair. White women constantly want to play with my hair. Like, is it real? So fucking annoying. Like, yes, you have the same hair on top of your head. Go away. Only white people touch my hair, she told me. Only middle-aged white women touch my hair. I've never had a black woman or an Aboriginal woman come up to me, or a Chinese person, even in Canada. You know, we have a lot of Japanese tourists and they take pictures with everyone and they're like, can I take a picture with you, please? You look so exotic. But if you say no, they won't. They're very polite. But these white women just walk up to me and just put their hands on my hair and I'm like, what the fuck are you doing? She laughs, but it's out of frustration rather than amusement. They say, can I touch your hair? And they touch. It's not a question because they're not pausing. It's the process of them already touching me. It's not like they're asking. It isn't actually a question. It isn't asking permission. They just want to do it anyway. And then say, but I asked. The fascination with curly hair is not harmless. It's performing playfulness while sending a loud message. One recent scenario took place in a tourist shop in which an older white haired woman approached Zena animatedly and said animatedly that while people with curly hair hate it when she touches it, she can't help herself and she has to do it anyway. And this woman, she said to me, can I pet you? While she was touching my hair. She pauses. She said pet. At that point, I remarked that it sounds like a lot like a display of power and domination, as if they are showing her who's the boss. Who's boss exactly, she exclaims. I feel like they're trying to show me who's boss because I've already said no, and they just do it anyway, and they pet me. Like, actually pet me. As if I'm like a puppy. If I turned around and pet her head, she would not accept it. She would swipe at my hand or step back or have some sort of reaction. They are taking charge of the situation. It doesn't really matter if I say yes or no, or it's not part of the discussion. She wants to do this and she will do it. It is her right as a white woman. So, what happens when she wants to do this at work? Zena describes the interaction with a coworker at an old job of hers in Canada. When they were both in the bathroom, she came out of the stalls and touched my hair before she washed her hands, and I was going to throw up. Like, I feel disgusted. So I complained, and she turned it into some kind of reverse racism thing. She said she was saying to the supervisor that I'm making it an uncomfortable working environment. I'm making it toxic or hostile because I'm not being friendly. That I should have manners, and I should be more open to that kind of thing with my coworkers. When Xenia made her complaint, she claims that her supervisor said, let this go. And HR responded by asking her whether or not the coworker had punched her or sexually assaulted her. When Xenia said no, but the touching was still uninvited and inappropriate, they said, I was acting aggressive and I wasn't a team player. Somehow I was the guilty party in this. She ended up losing that job after bringing up the incident again at a staff meeting. I'm like, please, we need to talk about boundaries and personal space and what's sexual harassment and what is racism. The management agreed to undertake sensitivity training, during which a video was played featuring a woman with dreadlocks instructing colleagues not to touch each other's hair. She burst into tears, Zena says of her coworker, and we were obviously shaming her and targeting her in front of the rest of the department. HR said I owed her an apology and said I had to apologize in front of everybody in a meeting, the same way I humiliated her in front of everybody. I refused, I said no, and I had to hand in my resignation. Not only did her workplace not try to change her mind about resigning, Zena said they were pleased to let her go. The manager thanked her for her resignation. Have a great last 2 weeks. Bye. They were so shocked that I stood up for myself that they were just relieved I was going to go. Nobody ever called them out on their soft racism before, but they was just happy to see me go. Perhaps the most startling aspect of Zena's experience is where this all occurred. She was an immigration officer for a Canadian Ministry of Immigration and had worked there for 7 years. If this seems surprising, it certainly did to me. Perhaps it shouldn't be given that even areas of servicing brown and black people was no exception. It was around 80% white people, she says. We had one Sikh guy, and there was me, the token Arab, one Asian person, but it wasn't very diverse. I mean, the department had 51 people, and we had 5 people who weren't white. If there's any field where you'd logically expect this kind of thing not to take place, it would be in the aid and not for profit sector. However, in early 2019, the sector was rocked by allegations of toxic working cultures, and Amnesty International, one of the most recognized non-governmental organizations in the world. A report had been commissioned following the suicide of two Amnesty's UK staff members who were found routinely bullying and harassing and discriminating against racial minorities and LGBTQ workers, as well as favoritism and nepotism in hiring and promotional processes. The nonprofit and philanthropy sector is really based on privilege, and that implies white privilege a lot of the time. Cristina Delgado tells me. The 27-year-old recently stated that her own coaching and consulting business, Hearts on Fleek, aimed specifically at the aid and nonprofit sector after she grew disenchanted with its racism and favoritism, sums up her experience of bringing up racist issues as a narrative of taking victimhood away from people of color to undermine their allegations. It positions us as a target of racism, but not as a target of racism, but as an agent of racism. I'm always targeted as the person being divisive and making something up, and I'm the one with the problem. Even though there's a lot of training that teaches us that reverse racism isn't a thing. I tweeted today that reverse racism does exist. That it's when you reverse your car over a racist just to make sure. And then, obviously, I got a 3-day ban on Twitter. It's still culturally and socially reinforced whenever you bring it up. Christina, who lives in Germany, is from the Bronx, New York. Her mother is indigenous El Salvadorian, and her father is from Puerto Rico and has Palestinian Arab heritage. Although she defines as Latine, she describes herself as ethnically ambiguous looking, which leads to objectification and tokenization. Okay, almost time to be finished. I was working at the humanitarian NGO in Turkey to serve Syrian and Palestinian refugees. The founder of the organization was a white woman who had the money to fund such work, but no previous experience. I have a background in Arabic language, international development, public health, and that's why she took me on. She tokenized me often to get legitimacy within the community, although I don't identify as Arab. Christina told me that the organization sought to dictate the needs of the community by the founders' white privilege standards, rather than to empower them and see them as true partners to develop and sustain programs geared towards their own needs. This is such a fucking white NGO thing to do. She wanted to offer yoga classes to newly arrived refugees from Syria who didn't have access to food or healthcare. She felt compelled to speak up against what she regarded as an abuse of power that affected the running of the organization. I confronted her about this. The harm that she was producing by seeing this community of displaced people as objects of charity rather than complex humans capable of deciding their own needs, and that she was centering herself rather than them. She cried and called me a racist monster for calling her out and left the room. The other white woman I worked with told me I needed to stop being sensitive and looking at race. Christina says her job became so stressful, she was hospitalized and eventually forced to quit, only to find herself having similar experiences elsewhere. Increasingly, she found that white women use their tears to police how she expresses herself and what issues she can discuss. I'm a trained communicator and negotiator, but I'm labeled as being divisive or an angry brown woman. In another incident, when she was part of a fellowship that she traveled to Turkey, one of the few non-white women in her group, she found herself part of a subgroup of 4 women of color who spoke up about Islamophobia and racism in the organization, only to be literally labeled as the Angry Brown Girls Club. It demerits what we say and overlooks our professional, academic, and lived experiences. When white women cry, it also makes them able to leave the conversation and choose not to listen, whereas women of color do not have the ability to choose to leave a conversation when we have made someone uncomfortable. White women believe that their womanhood puts them on the same level of oppression as us, and this is where the conversation stops. They seem to believe in equality to the point that they are more interested in having the same power and privilege as white men, rather than dismantling the oppressive attitudes and systems for all. It's angering, because I'm on their team and I don't understand why our narratives can't bolster each other up. Christina sees the differences between the United States and Europe. Germany, they have this horrible past and they have more cultural reckoning with the abuse of power from World War II, and so there's generally more openness. This openness, however, doesn't seem to extend to her industry. It's still within the sector, the social impact sector, trying to tell people that you can't talk about race whatsoever. It still happens. I think that the American context, it happens no matter what you're engaging in. Here, I feel a bit better because Germans are in many ways, more willing to sit through and listen. Whereas in America, we've never had a reckoning with our history of slavery and colonialism, imperialism. Neither has Canada. You name it, global interventions to this day. So we've had a chance to look at our own backyard. We haven't had a chance to look at our own backyard, whereas Germany has. Another country that hasn't had a reckoning is Australia. Rashida arrived in Australia as an Afghan refugee after leaving refugee camps with her family. Now in her 30s, she's had similar experiences to Christina in the nonprofit sector. Despite being Afghan, not Arab, she has frequently found herself to be the organization's media face and voice for any issues to do with the Middle East. A tokenism that she says has not translated to respect and promotion in the organization. Like Christina, she has found herself in uncomfortable work meetings in which she is the sole woman of color, surrounded by white women colleagues who can't or don't understand why she brings up racism and representation. All right, I will carry on with Rashida's story next week. I shall see you next week, Anthony. Yeah, please remind me because I had surgery on Monday, and so I'm in a lot of pain. Bye.